Hi, everybody. Welcome to another installment of Committee for Sydney Live. I'll just take a minute to let everybody get in. I'm Gabriel Metcalf, the CEO of the Committee for Sydney. We are really excited today to have Tom Wright, who is the CEO of the Regional Plan Association. I'll explain a little bit about the RPA briefly and also what this word region means, because it means something different in Australian than it does in American. So the RPA is a group that I have long admired. It's been very influential on my thinking and lots of people's thinking. It is more or less the counterpart of the Committee for Sydney for the New York, New Jersey-Connecticut region. But it's been around for 100 years. It is it's something that I think the committee can really aspire to learn from. We were actually going to host the RPA staff along with counterparts in San Francisco and Chicago in Sydney this month, except for the pandemic shut everything down. But we were going to be doing this talk in person in Sydney. So the RPA is known for a series of 3 plans. And Tom, I think it's in the 20s, in the 60s, in the 90s were the first 3, which when you go to planning school, you read these, you study them. And then, and Tom project managed the 3rd plan in the 90s. But then he actually, as CEO, led the 4th plan, which came out in 2017. So these are very significant pieces of work. The 4th plan has 61 ideas in transport and housing and governance, climate change, lots of other issues. So I know Tom will be sharing some of the framework coming out of the 4th plan. So let me talk about this word region. In Australian, the word region means rural, means a country town. In American, region means metropolitan. So a regional plan in American would mean the plan for all of Greater Sydney. We'll just translate back and forth. We know what you mean. When you say region, Tom, it means metropolitan. New York is one of the centers, one of the epicenters of the pandemic in America. All of us, our hearts go out to the people in New York and what you all have been going through. We are really appreciative of you taking time to share your thoughts and observations with us. The way this works, everyone, if you've been on these, Tom will give his talk and then we'll open it up for questions, which you submit via the Zoom app, and I will sort through those and combine them and ask Tom questions. So take it away, Tom.
Thanks. Thanks, Gabe, so much. And what I'm going to do is now try and share my screen, see if this will work, and pull this up. And I hope now you're all seeing my PowerPoint. Is that working?
It's working. You're all good.
Okay, great. Thanks. Gabe, it's great always to talk with you, my good friend. And I'll just say I'm really sorry that I'm not there with you in person. I would have preferred to have had life not been interrupted by this extraordinary situation and really the tragedy that's unfolding right now. I am talking from really the region, the city that has been so far hardest hit, fastest hit in the United States for various reasons. I'll talk about that some. And so as an organization that has historically done long-range planning, we've suddenly had to shift everything to, to the current situation, because it just seems at some point we hope to get back to being able to think about, think over 5, 10, 15, 20 years and plan for a longer term, better future. But right now, the next couple days, weeks, months are so daunting that we've just as an organization really shifted what we do to focus on that. What I'm going to do very briefly is talk a little bit more about RPA and the history, just so you have a sense of the association. Talk some about, tracking some of the spread of the virus, and mostly this data. And some of the data is actually even a few days old, and everything gets out of date very quickly on this. But just show kind of some of the patterns that we're seeing emerge, and then talk a bit about kind of what we think the future will look like, and what we're doing as an organization to try and address it. Just quickly on the history, as Gabe mentioned, we're actually only 98 years old, not quite 100. But in May of 1922, a group of civic and business leaders, politicians, then Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover, later US President, joined in a meeting to kind of launch this effort to create the first regional plan for the tri-state metropolitan region. It's a completely civic effort, and I think you guys, everybody with the Committee for Sydney understands that, but often when I go other places and talk about this, there's a kind of assumption that we're somehow connected to the public sector, that we're chartered by the states or the federal government, that we're funded by the public. That's not the case at all. Instead, in fact, really, when you look at, and this is a map of the portions of the 3 states, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, it's not all of them. It's 31 counties. It's essentially southwestern Connecticut, all of New York City and Long Island and the Hudson Valley and northern New Jersey. That incorporates 782 towns and cities. There is not any federal, state, local government institution that thinks about this entire region. We do have regional entities, region the way I think of it, metropolitan, like the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which governs the Hudson River and the ports, the seaports, the airports, the bridges and tunnels that cross the Hudson River. But it doesn't include Connecticut, it doesn't include mass transit, it doesn't do any land use planning. We have a Metropolitan Transportation Authority that runs the New York City subways and bus system, and 2 of our 3 commuter rails on Long Island and in Westchester and Connecticut. But again, it doesn't include land use planning, it doesn't include New Jersey. So we have this enormous fragmented, even literally at the federal system, Connecticut is part of what's called Region 1 with Massachusetts and New England, and New York, New Jersey, and Puerto Rico are Region 2. So even literally the federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency or Department of Transportation don't think of this as a single region. But only RPA as a private nonprofit performs that service and has thought about this for essentially for a century now. As Gabe mentioned, in the last century, we created 3 major landmark plans that we're very proud of. In 1929, we released the first plan, and it laid out essentially the circumferential highway system. Very famously, the Port Authority had been planning to build the first bridge over the Hudson River, now the George Washington Bridge at 57th Street, which would have brought the I-95, the entire Northeast corridor highway system through Midtown Manhattan. And RPA's planners suggested that we push it up to the tip of Manhattan because it would connect the Mid-Atlantic to New England. And we created essentially this kind of new highway system, as limited access highways were new technology. That plan was really about trying to decongest the overcrowded population, the overcrowding conditions that existed in the core of the region. The way we kind of think of it was within a couple decades, we had succeeded too well. And now we're worried about emptying out of our urban centers. And so in the 1960s, the second regional plan, which was a series of reports, helped create the MTA with Governor Rockefeller and identified communities where jobs could locate, places like Stamford, Connecticut, White Plains, New York, New Brunswick, New Jersey. But really, it was all about trying to kind of limit growth in the exurbs and rural parts of the region and re-energize cities. In '96, the third regional plan came out, which really tried to find more effective ways of promoting many of the same recommendations of the second regional plan. In particular, I'm very proud of this, that plan first called for charging motorists to drive into Manhattan, congestion pricing before it existed in London or Stockholm or other cities, and to reinvest in the mass transit network, including major expansions of the subway system, of the commuter rail system, and other pieces of it. Each of these plans had some major influential successes, but we're kind of one organization, fighting in a very big region. And so 2.5 years ago, we released the fourth regional plan, which kind of updated and modernized a lot of what we've done. We had one of the, and this is kind of especially poignant right now, one of the things we pointed out was that since 1996, the New York region, we had been attacked by terrorists on 9/11. We had suffered through the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and then been walloped by Superstorm Sandy. And so, excuse me, bless me. Each of those had kind of really changed the way we thought about things like climate change and protection and others. We also were kind of seeing what we would kind of call catastrophic success, where job growth was running up, technology industry was growing very rapidly, and so the costs of housing were becoming much more difficult, overcrowding on our mass transit network. In some ways, we were failing to manage the success that we were having. So the fourth plan, when we put it out, the first thing is that we're a values-driven organization. And so when we released the plan, we put out major reports on what we considered kind of the four major values and goals of the plan, of addressing equity, health, prosperity, and sustainability. And very importantly for us, it's not about trying to achieve one of these over the others, but figuring out what the balance and how to make them all go together at the same time was. And health, we were very proud of connecting public health to the plan and looking at our recommendations around housing, around job growth, around sustainability, et cetera, all through a health lens also. And so that was important, and obviously has come around quite a bit in the last couple of weeks. As Gabe mentioned, we had 61 major recommendations, but we kind of created 4 major buckets for each of them. Fixing the institutions that are failing us. This was about the public sector and the failure of the regional authorities to be able to address things, all the way down to local planning in those 782 cities and towns. By the way, I'll point out to those of you who don't know us so well, of those 782 cities and towns, one of them is New York City, and it's 8.5 million people, and 781 are not. And local planning in the United States is often done at the municipal level. So that's 781 towns often doing land use plans really kind of ignorant or sometimes even contradictory to what New York City is trying to do. We talked about rising to the challenge of climate change. This was really the biggest change since 1996, was the recognition of what a major issue it was. Creating a dynamic, customer-oriented transportation system, trying to modernize those systems. And this big focus, of course, on the subways, which is the lifeblood of New York, but also everything from road pricing, fixing our airports, our global gateway, goods movement, et cetera. And then making the region affordable for everyone and really addressing the housing crisis. I'm not going to go into, obviously, all of those recommendations, but I'll just give you a little sense of kind of what some of the key ideas were. On fixing the institutions that are failing us, we talked about reforming the major transportation authorities and reducing the cost of projects. One of the reasons we are unable to make major investments is because we have, and it's a failure across the board. It is everything from the choosing of projects to the environmental review, to the funding, to the procurement process, to labor laws, all of which are outdated and add to and make it 2 to 3 times more expensive to do major capital investments in New York as other global cities, including, I don't know where we stack up to Sydney, but we are 2 or 3 times more expensive than places like London and Paris, which aren't exactly kind of low-cost cities. putting a price on driving through tolling. And we had a huge success after working on this for over 20 years. Early last year, the New York State Legislature passed a state budget that includes, we hope in January of 2021, we will start charging all drivers to enter Manhattan, using both to reduce traffic congestion and using the money that it generates to pay for new investments in mass transit, pricing greenhouse gas emissions, establishing a resiliency commission, increasing civic engagement. So we had a lot of these issues across the board. But just to pull out one again, I've already mentioned, but managing congestion through revenues and price controls is a really exciting opportunity, and something that we expect still to move forward, even with what's going on, and to be a game changer. I mean, we anticipate this will generate close to $1.5 billion every single year for investment in mass transit. It's a key part of a $50 billion capital plan. And it will, I think, for Americans and their kind of famous love affair with the automobile, it's a resetting of the landscape. And it's starting to really push in that direction of thinking of complete streets, other modes of transportation, and not just thinking that automobiles are the highest and best use of every square inch of land. In terms of affordability, we're trying to radically generate and gin up and increase housing production, and then also create more good paying jobs. On housing production, a lot of it, we've done research just looking at anything from accessory dwelling units, we call them, making it easier for mature suburban communities to add auxiliary units, increasing zoning densities, investing more in affordable housing. And so we've been working on a number of ways, and whether it's in New York City to rezone communities or changing our financing methods. And we're seeing some progress here. And I know Gabe spent years knocking his head against a wall in San Francisco, where I think they failed miserably to address this. In terms of climate change, it's really trying to work with communities and recognize that we developed in certain places we shouldn't have, and sometimes we have to pull back, and we can't really expect the public sector. It's not a great strategy for elected leaders to say, you know, we're gonna give up in this area. But we as a independent organization can do that. We also talked about creating a new climate resilience park in the Meadowlands, which is a area in northern New Jersey that never should have been built on, and it's flooding. And then really dealing with renewable energies and trying to ramp up dramatically, creating a new energy grid and moving in that direction. And just to kind of point out other things that we can do as a regional organization, one of the things I was proud of was our team kind of identified existing trails and parks throughout the region, and then mapped out what the missing pieces were and identified those. And then groups within groups like the Trust for Public Land and conservation groups across the region have taken this map and used it as a roadmap to fill in those missing pieces so that we can create a truly regional trail network. And then finally, on transportation, which is probably where we're best known, we proposed a much more aggressive timetable and strategy for reconstructing and modernizing the subway system within 15 years. When we started this work, the MTA's plan was to do this over 50 years. Around the same time that we released this, a new head of the Transit Authority came in, Andy Byford, a celebrated person who eventually left after some political battles, and I don't know where he'll go next, but whoever gets him is very lucky. So if Sydney needs a modernization of its subways, you should be trying to get Andy. But also expanding Trans-Hudson capacity, opening up streets, designing streets for people. Right now, actually, one of the things we're really excited about is while our streets are empty, given this current situation, and I'll talk about this in a bit, but transit ridership and other things have all dropped dramatically. But the usage of City Bike, our bike share program, has exploded in New York. It's up by 67% over a year ago. And so we ought to be thinking more about designing streets for people and other things. And eventually, we do think people will get back in airplanes again. And Kennedy and Newark airports, our global gateways, are in terrible shape and really need to be expanded and redesigned. The biggest one with this is what we call the Gateway Program, which is essentially doubling capacity under the Hudson River. This is the core of the entire Northeast Corridor, which runs from Boston to Washington. We had a deal 4 years ago with the Obama administration for the federal government to pay for half of this and each of the two states to pay for a quarter. President Trump essentially kind of ripped that up. And we've spent the last 3 years trying to figure out how to get enough money locally to advance portions of this and make the argument that this is a critical project and kind of move it forward. And about an hour ago, Governor Cuomo came out of a meeting with President Trump to talk about these issues, and I expect that this was on the agenda during that conversation. So now I'm going to pivot for a minute and just talk some about what's happening locally with COVID-19. As Gabe said, we are the epicenter in the United States, and the United States didn't expect to find itself being one of the worst countries in terms of dealing with this, but I think ineptitude at the federal level has led us to where we are. This data is about a week old, and I'm sorry, but we already have more than 250,000 cases and over 16,000 deaths in the tri-state region alone. More concentrated in the core of the region, as you can see, in New York City and Brooklyn, Queens, Nassau County, and Westchester were especially hard hit, the kind of eastern portions of the city initially. But even that is only showing a tiny bit. Only 2% of the population has been tested. The fact that 42% of the tests are coming back positive means that it's not really an effective rate. It's simply indicative of how little testing we're doing and how much more we need to ramp up. And what we've been seeing, of course, and this is, I think, sadly, what we see all over the world, is the kind of rapid escalation. For a long time, the numbers were very low to non-existent, and I think public leaders convinced themselves that they could keep it under check. And then when they started to increase, it was already too late. The truth is that the increases that they were seeing in the middle of March were really indicative of things that had happened 2 weeks earlier at the beginning of March. More recently, we have flattened the curve, as we like to say, and been showing for about 8 days now in New York. The numbers have not gone up, but either been flat or a slight decrease, and we hope in some ways that the good news also lags. But the toll has been extraordinary, and we've been seeing about 1,000 deaths a day for the past couple of weeks. And even if things are improving, we don't expect those numbers to come down too soon. And so it has been an absolute crisis. Just to give you a sense, the MTA, which runs the subways and buses in New York, now has reported 78 members of its workforce have died. On Saturday, my friend Ray Kenny, who ran rail operations for New Jersey Transit, succumbed to this, the head of rail operations for the second largest commuter rail agency in the country. In particular, public officials have been especially hard hit. People going about, the frontline workers are people in transit, are people at the hospitals, are people in retail, and public officials. And the heads of the Port Authority, the MTA, and New Jersey Transit have all been diagnosed with it. 2 of them have subsequently gotten better, and we're hopeful for the third also. But these are people. It's also, in the US, we have, as I'm sure you're all aware, a real legacy, a sad and tragic and despicable legacy of racism, of inequality, of unequal access to opportunity. And COVID-19 preys on that. And as you can see, death rates per 100,000 age adjusted by race and ethnicity show that Blacks and Latinos are suffering at roughly twice the rate of whites and Asians. This is for a lot of reasons. They work in industries that don't allow them to work from home, so many of them have to stay exposed. They live with in more cramped quarters. They don't have, their underlying health is not as good. And so in many ways, this system has really kind of revealed what was already worst about our society and is exploiting it in a really terrible way. And we've mapped at RPA what we called kind of CDC, the Center for Disease Control's social vulnerability index, just identifying where people, it's based on several factors from age, income, access to healthcare, but also obesity rates, high blood pressure, asthma rates, and others, all of which correlate with a high morbidity from this. And what you see are some pockets of poverty in rural parts, but largely it's the urban areas which are most highly hit. Just to kind of round out some more of the of what's going on here, we had a housing crisis before, and of course we'd spend a lot of time at RPA trying to figure out how to generate more affordable housing and increase housing supply, and now of course it's hitting very hard. Just from March to April, we went from 1 in every 400 mortgages in forbearance, people unable to pay their monthly mortgage, to 1 in 28. And roughly a third of all renters did not pay their April rent on time. There have been, each of the states has been putting out various guidelines trying to protect people for 30, 60, 90 days, but a lot of those methods are kind of questionable enforcement and simply push the payment. You know, many of the landlords are essentially demanding, okay, well then you'll owe me 3 months rent in 3 months, which isn't going to really help people who've lost jobs out of this. We already had over 100,000 homeless people in the region and over 500,000 people living in what we consider overcrowded households. That's more than one person per room in an apartment. And just that the fair market rent for a studio in our region is $450 more than the federal stimulus checks that are supposed to be arriving. So the housing crisis that we already had is being deeply exacerbated by this. As I mentioned earlier, transit ridership has been crushed too. The MTA's ridership is down by about 95% on average across its system. And the MTA relies on fares. We rely on fares and revenues from riders to pay for about 50% of the operating cost of our system, which I think is much higher than most global cities and global systems. This means, of course, that income has deteriorated to such a degree that I was talking to people at the MTA earlier today, and they are literally watching cash and trying to figure out how to keep making payroll. And so they are in an operating crisis. New Jersey Transit service is down by 90%. Bus service in Connecticut actually only down by 50%, but there's also a class divide, which is that you see that Manhattan, which is a wealthier borough in New York, has seen its subway ridership down by 75% because more people who live in Manhattan can work at home through their jobs. They're white collar workers. Whereas in the Bronx, where more people are blue collar workers, subway ridership is down by only 55%. And frankly, at a time when we want people to stay off the system because we're afraid of spreading the virus, there are pictures in social media of overcrowded subway cars running through the Bronx. And really what you're thinking about is people putting their lives at risk to go to work. We do expect that we think that over 30% of the people on the MTA are what we call essential workers, all working either in providing healthcare, providing essential services, providing food, and others that we have to see. Another of the kind of major effects behind this, we've seen, I've already talked about inequality and how it's playing out, but air pollution in particular has been shown to create higher mortality rates with this disease. And air pollution, there are higher levels in communities of color. There's a kind of strong correlation between those, all of which is making things worse. A lot of what we've been doing at RPA has been kind of early on, just trying to track and record what's going on, put out kind of opinion pieces to try and argue for what we think are kind of good policy, while there are a lot of folks who are kind of losing their cool. Some of it has just been making sure that folks who live in the cities have access to open space so that they can get sunlight, they can get out without getting in crowded conditions and finding themselves too close to each other. Other parts of it have been trying to kind of anticipate what we expected to come next, doing, say, for helping with the rent crisis, arguing for policies to extend credit and allow people to restructure their mortgages and loans and other things. We've also been kind of advocating for emergency aid, and this means going to Washington, D.C. and calling and trying to make arguments. Originally, the first federal relief bill included nothing for the transit agencies. And so we joined forces with other groups around the country and some in Washington. Almost 250 organizations signed on to a letter, and we're placing calls and kind of, trying to slam our members of Congress. And it did lead to a $25 billion transit aid being included in the first federal relief bill. That was good, much better than nothing. I will point out as a New Yorker that the MTA generates about 40%, it provides 40% of the transit ridership in the United States. And it got about 4 billion of the 25, much less than it's once again kind of. It often seems that the playing field in the United States is tipped against our major urban areas for lots of reasons. And so the MTA just last week actually had McKinsey do an excellent study for them, and has gone back and is essentially asking for another $4 billion and talking about what will they have to do just for operating costs if they don't get that to kind of get them through the end of the year. So we've been kind of, as I mentioned earlier, doing a lot of advocacy around open space and trying to make sure that there are places for people to go and be safe. And we could talk about this some, but it's been really inconsistent with how the public reads this. And I think it's a strange situation that as the weather improves and as the spring is coming on and people, usually we're opening up and starting to go out more, and suddenly we're being told you can't, or if you do, you have to stay far away from people. And so making sure that we are opening parks. We have been working with, I would say, a reluctant mayoral administration in New York to try and advocate for more street closures so that pedestrians can take over streets. There's not much demand for them with the cars anyway, and pushing those. And then, of course, tying this to climate change. And we're not the first people. I think many people have recognized this, but in many ways, climate change is a slow-moving pandemic, and it shares a lot of characteristics with what we're seeing with COVID-19. It's global in nature, the deadliness of it, the kinds of people who are most vulnerable to it. And so even as we're dealing with these short-term situations, the crisis, we do find ourselves trying to talk about that. Now I'm just going to talk as I kind of close a little bit. Gabe gave us, these aren't exactly, Gabe, the 5 stages that you gave us, but I think instead of denial, you might have suggested dithering, but I'm trying to share this with politicians. But we've kind of identified 5 different phases that we talk about, with the denial being kind of where our elected leaders and the public were until they recognized we had to work on this. The lockdown, which is where we are today, and then thinking about a transition, a recovery, and renewal. And so we've been focused very much on what do we need to be doing as a society? What does the private sector need to do? What does the public sector need to do? And what should happen at a regional level as we move into the transition, recovery, and renewal phases? We do a lot of scenario planning at RPA. And so we've been kind of thinking through multiple scenarios and saying, what do we think is likely to happen? What is possible to happen? Trying not just to see it all negatively, but maybe there will be some opportunities that come out of this in terms of improving health and income security, addressing some of the inequalities at the core of our society. But likely we expect a long and uneven recovery, something that'll take us at least through 2021. 2 to 3 years is kind of what most folks are projecting as the best case scenario. We know that there's going to be a lot more debt, that the public agencies are going to end up borrowing money that they have to pay back, that private companies and households are going to borrow money. We know that poverty and homelessness are going to go up. We also do think that there will be new industries and opportunities that do come out of this. There will be more things like remote work, learning, telemedicine, and that we expect travel restrictions to stay with us. Then there are these kind of possible things that people talk about, longer term health impacts, whether new pandemics come, what would happen if we were to have a storm another superstorm Sandy while we were locked down? What would happen if we were to lose energy and have a blackout? Will we become an even more segregated community? Will people, refuse to come back to transit? And the big one is kind of people talk about, will there be a flight from cities? Will people be afraid to come back to cities? I will say on that one, I'm old enough to remember 9/11. I've been working at RPA since that time. On September 10th in 2001, New York City had 4 super tall towers, the World Trade Center towers, the Empire State Building, and the Chrysler Building. On September 11th, we lost 2 of them and we went down to 2. And people were saying for months after that, everyone very confidently predicting, nobody will ever want to go in a tall tower again. We'll never do that. We're going to not stop building tall. People won't feel safe or anything like that. Today, we have 20 super tall towers in New York City. We don't just work in them, but many of them are even residential. I've been told, I've never gone up in any of those, where the super rich have been going. We have another 8 under construction or in permitting. And so I just want to, I think we should be very hesitant to kind of assume major changes in people's behavior or what society will expect. The way we've been thinking about it is that changes that were coming may be accelerated by this. The use of technology for conversations like the one we're having today, telemedicine, again, work from home, other things. Some of those were happening anyway, or e-commerce and ordering remotely, and then the decline of local retail. Many of those things I think that those are more likely to accelerate than we are likely to see a kind of 180-degree turn. But we've been kind of thinking about, if I take the phases, the transition, recovery, and renewal phase, and then think of them and create a graph, laying them against the 4 values that RPA identified, health, equity, prosperity, and sustainability, we actually think that this kind of provides a little bit of a framework to think about the different phases. And as we go through the transition phase, on health, the priority is going to be on scaling up testing and free access to healthcare. But through the recovery, we'll start to try and work for health in all policies and towards a kind of universal acceptance of health, all the way down to on sustainability. Through the transition, we will definitely be thinking about climate planning. But as we recover, we're going to be really focused on scaling up renewable energy and trying to create a long-term carbon market and adaptation plan. So I hope that's a kind of useful framework for kind of thinking about these things. Just to close, at RPA, what we're specifically doing, we're definitely working on a kind of coordinated regional response. I cannot take credit for the announcement last week. Governor Cuomo, or New York governor, who now has a very high national profile because of his calm and steady hand, announced that he was working with the 6 other states on the coast, from Delaware up to Massachusetts, that they were going to coordinate their next phases, that they were going to, not necessarily all commit to working exactly hand in glove, but that they would be coordinating, because as he mentioned, if we, keep bars closed in Manhattan, but New Jersey opens them up, people will just start going over to New Jersey to get drinks, and that's not going to work for anybody. So we found ourselves in the middle of those efforts, and there's actually a kind of major commission now that's been established. Each of the governors has appointed 3 people, their chief of staff, a chief economic development, a chief public health expert, to work on that, and we're going to be supporting those efforts. We continue to advocate for more federal aid for the region. Right now, it's all relief, but we hope later in the year and potentially in 2021 to be talking about stimulus to help restart our economy. We're continuing to sponsor national, international conversations on these issues, including health equity. We're going to have a major event next month. We're developing these scenarios with our partners at companies. AECOM, a terrific company we work with that works on transportation issues, and WSP, some of the major construction companies, management consultants, all are members of our board, are generous supporters of our work, and are really very, very valuable partners in the kind of work that we do. And eventually we're going to take a fresh look at the regional plan, at the fourth plan, because we do have to rethink some of these things. And maybe some of the priorities that we identified 3 and 4 years ago are not as high anymore, and other things are going to be higher in the list. That's probably slightly for a later day, but that's kind of some of the thinking. So that is my my presentation. I thank you for bearing with me, and I'd be happy to take any questions from Gabe or anybody else. Thanks.
Great, Tom. Thank you so much. Yeah, I like seeing the what you've done with the 5-phase framework, which we've been using to organize our thinking. It's helpful.
It's excellent, Gabe, and I stole it freely from you.
Yeah, good. So, all right, many questions in response to that. Tom, you used a very a great phrase, catastrophic success, to describe what New York was like. Also, I think what Sydney was like in some ways, meaning such a great city, such a strong economy, which leads to so much demand for people wanting to be there, which means it gets really expensive. It gets crowded. The systems can't handle the just level of growth. I know that Australia over many years has had about 3 times the rate of immigration as the United States. And basically half of it comes to Sydney, half to Melbourne. Is that over now? As you think about New York, looking forward, or will in a few years will New York be once again faced with the problems of success?
So and I have having grown up in the city, I remember as a kid in the 1970s when we were coming out of a bankruptcy crisis essentially, and New York really lost over the course in the decade of the 70s. New York City lost about 1 million people out of its population. It would have lost 2 million, but during that decade, we also, thank God, had about 1 million immigrants move in to mitigate that. And if we had had a 2 million population loss, we would probably be closer to Detroit today than where we are. And it took about 20 years until the 90s for New York to really start to recover. And there are people who are saying that is what we face, the danger, that there's a real possibility that that's what's ahead of us now, that the loss of jobs and the economic harm that's going to happen over the next 6 to 18 months is going to lead us to that. And a lot of people also, some of the kind of leading thinkers and economic development people, actually the former head of the New York City Economic Development Corporation was telling me in December that he thought that probably sometime in the middle of last year we actually stopped growing. And it was one of these things where we were still in the lag, and we would discover about this summer that we had already gone that way. I think that absolutely things had slowed down, that some of the positive trends we were seeing and the catastrophic success we were suffering from had really started to kind of diminish already before this. And then the timing of this is pretty devastating. That said, 9/11, 2008, Superstorm Sandy, especially 2008, 2009, there was a feeling, I mean, that was a financial crisis triggered by the core industry in New York City. And so there was a real sense that that we weren't going to recover from that. And in the end, we did quite well. It turned out the tech industry was booming, that people really wanted to visit New York, that the quality of life was quite great. And I even have colleagues who say, the only major thing that they think happened out of that was that they were able to afford an apartment for the first time. And that young people who had been completely priced out for a decade since 9/11 saw a little window where they were able to move in and purchase. I don't think we're going to go back to where we were a year or two ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. I don't think we're going to see that level of growth again. I'm going to turn on my light. It might be, it's getting dark here in New York. That's okay. So I don't think I think that we're in for a very difficult 6 to 12 months, maybe 18 to 24, that the longer it takes to turn it around, the longer it'll take to recover. Then I think we're in for a period of not catastrophic success, but if we're lucky, a little bit more of a sustained success.
Tom, a question about your thinking about fiscal stimulus. Groups like the RPA would naturally tend to advocate for old-fashioned Keynesian spending on public works because you get something at the end of that.
Yeah.
That makes the world better. And so certainly the Committee for Sydney has been putting forward project lists of investments we think should happen. But the economists are really skeptical for a good reason. They're skeptical because it takes a long time to spend the money on public works, except for the projects that you're about to do anyway. So they were all planned and approved and ready to go. How are you thinking about this? Where do you see opportunity here?
In a very similar way. Look, here's the situation. The MTA has an operating crisis on its hands, and they really don't know. They need to come up with $4 billion in a couple of weeks or months, and if they don't, they can't keep running the system, and they can't raise the fares because nobody's riding on the trains anyway. They can't reduce service and fire their staff. They can't throw 100,000 people out of work in the middle of this situation. At the end of the day, if they don't get federal money, they are going to have to raid the capital plan and the money that's supposed to go to that to pay for operations. In the short term, if what we're talking about is 3 months worth or something like that, we will probably support that. But that will mean that either the capital plan gets squeezed or more debt gets added onto it. The MTA has about a $60 billion outstanding debt right now. At the same time, the cost of capital is extremely low, is effectively zero. One of the things I've been pushing in conversations is, even though the cost of borrowing for the MTA with the state of New York behind it is a good thing, but all of our public authority credit ratings were downgraded last week, which means that it'll cost them a little bit more for all that. And so maybe credit enhancement from the federal government is something that we could do. And that if $60 billion has to become $65 billion in debt, at least it could if we can shave something off of the cost. But let me just to flip it to a slightly different. One of the things we've been seeing, we kind of canvassed last week our partners in local and county government around the region to say, what are you seeing in Suffolk County, which is the eastern end of Long Island? What are you seeing in Westchester County? What's happening in New Jersey? And even though essentially all construction has stopped, permitting is going on very effectively and quickly. And these towns, even though they're working from home, the clerks and the inspectors and the people who work in the municipal agencies are still going ahead processing the environmental statements and doing the reviews and the permitting and things like that. I think there are two reasons for that. One is I think that the private sector, the property owners, the people who wanted to build a new housing project, want to borrow money while it's cheap and want to get their projects at the top of the pipeline for a recovery. And I think the public sector wants to support that too. And I'm hopeful that that's a positive move, and that what we're seeing is a kind of getting ready to jump in, not with a new gateway tunnel under the Hudson River for $10 billion, but with lots of small construction projects and lots of other things. We screwed this up. The last time we had a major federal stimulus was in 2009, right after the 2008 election. I was going down to Washington. I don't know if, Gabe, you were going at the time, and we were going and trying to argue for federal funding for high-speed rail and mass transit and energy and renewable energy and all the things. And we screwed up. We did a terrible job. The ERA Act and things in 2009 was small. It didn't have any real good stimulus money. So we're hopeful that we'll do a better job this time. And maybe by moving the permits through now, we could actually get construction crews on the ground, later this year.
Tom, a question about the way the polarization in American politics is affecting New York City. One of the things you and I have been talking about is that the experience in Australia has actually been very confirming for people, restoring their confidence in their government.
Yeah.
There's an innovation that's happened, which is something called cabinet here, where all the states and territories and the federal government are sitting down together to jointly make decisions about the pandemic. And apparently this is it sounds very obvious, but apparently this was the last time this system was used within World War II. But it's working really well here.
Yeah.
And of course, in New York, you're seeing the federal government today threatening to sue states if governors impose lockdowns, and just the complete coming apart. It's before COVID, people were using the phrase to describe America that it was in a cold civil war, a civil war that didn't yet involve fighting. The question for I guess you guys is what does that mean for a city like New York? How do you navigate that? Because you can't wish it away. You can't just make it be different.
You can't wish it away. And before this struck, if you looked at the 4th regional plan that we produced 2.5 years ago, you would not have seen much mention at all of the federal government, because we kind of assume the feds are not there for us. We just don't, we are always on the short end of the stick of any kind of federal funding that comes out and things. So we weren't really paying much attention to them. Now we find ourselves, because of the nature of this and the scope and scale of this, needing the federal government, which is a very uncomfortable place for us to be, because of all of the things that you're talking about. Look, locally, I think that we're seeing something similar to what you're talking about. I am not, and I have to be very careful, we are a nonpartisan organization, and my tax-exempt status depends on me not endorsing candidates or anything else like this. We have seen uneven public responses. The mayor de Blasio announced that gyms were being shut down because they weren't safe. And then he went out and got one last workout in before the shutdown went in by a couple hours, as if somehow it didn't occur to him that was going to be sending a very mixed message to people. And he has been unbelievably slow on doing things like opening streets and public space, and it's just not very effective. And for some of us, quite frankly, we long for the days. If Mayor Bloomberg were still in office, I think thousands of people's lives would have been saved. And at the federal level, it's ridiculous. It's kind of, it tax one way this day and then this hour, and then in a different direction. To some degree, I would say that the way we deal with it is by trying to shut it out, by trying not to pay attention. And our governors have emerged as effective public leaders. Governor Phil Murphy in New Jersey had about a 40% kind of support approval rating 2 or 3 months ago, and he's now over 70%. And just like Governor Cuomo, he does a daily press conference where he answers all questions, and he has expressed strong leadership and said, we're not going to open too soon, and we're going to hammer this thing, and here's what the science tells us, and here's how I'm making my decisions and being as transparent as possible. Governor Cuomo obviously is a national candidate. And so I think that what we're seeing is a kind of moving in 2 different directions. And the federal government, I can't believe what's going on with people, mobs going and ginned up to liberate Virginia and things like that. It's terrible, and it's a tragedy because it's going to cost lives. But I think that we have strong leadership at the gubernatorial level right now in all 3 of our states, in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, and even with the neighboring states. And it's apolitical. There's no politics really involved in it. And so we've started to see, and in some ways that's the genius of the US model, of course. What did Winston Churchill say? The Americans will do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Well, it's a laboratory and an experiment. And right now, I would say our federal government is failing us miserably. But thank God, we also have states. if the governors would probably be the first to say they wish they didn't need to show this leadership. They wish that the federal government was, and I don't know how we're going to do the testing and the tracking and the things that we're going to need in the next phase without strong federal leadership, but I don't think we're going to get it. So, and I don't mean to sound political, but
No,
it's,
you don't.
I just got to call a spade a spade.
Tom, is public transport safe? There's a question lots of people are wondering about. There is we predicted there would be an attack on urbanism, an attack on density, and indeed that's happening.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of evidence to show that the spread of the virus is not particularly correlated with density.
Right.
But there's a question that remains in many people's minds about crowding people onto trains and buses. How are you thinking about that?
We're going to rethink what we consider acceptable density in all aspects of our lives, and obviously trains and buses are where we are most crowded in with people. And my answer is they're safe as long as the only people on them are the essential workers. If people who don't need to be on them try and get back on them, that will bring the levels up to places where they aren't safe. And that is happening in parts of our system, and it shouldn't. And so people should avoid riding the buses or trains unless they need to, because we have enough capacity to safely move the essential workforce. And that's really the way we should think about it. It's safe as long as the only people using it are the ones who have to. But the same thing, I mean, look, the other question about this is kind of, our commercial office space and our millions of square feet of commercial office space. Are they going to empty out because everyone's going to work at home? And we're very well supported by the real estate industry and have close ties with them because they are long-term investors and supporters of New York, and they're not people who just are planning to leave. And talking to folks in that industry, they say, well, on the one hand, I think employers expect after this changes more people to be telecommuting and flexible hours and things. They won't stop coming to New York City because there's still an advantage to that great creative, innovative hub and being there. But maybe they need to be there 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week. And maybe they'll be shifting their hours and the way. And I think that probably will happen. At the same time, so I've heard from some of my friends in this industry that their largest tenants have called them and said, hey, when we start to open up, we've spent the last 20 years trying to figure out how to pack more people into smaller spaces to save money on rent. And we've discovered we've gone too far, and we're actually going to have to provide more space per office worker. And you could imagine those two trends kind of canceling each other out. At the end of the day, the office building still being filled with just slightly fewer people. So it's too early to predict that, specifically around mass transit. I'm not riding it because that's what I do to support mass transit. That's how I can become part of the solution. And I think that it's as long as people who don't need to be on it aren't on it, it is safe. And I think that the people working in transit are heroes through this entire effort, and they need and deserve all of our support.
All right, Tom, we're out of time. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. We are watching the numbers of new cases in New York go down, and we're hoping you get through this and to the other side as safely and as soon as possible.
Thanks, Gabe. I think we'll all learn from each other. This will be a global dialogue, and unfortunately with us for a long time. And you know how much I admire you and the work you do. And I love Sydney, and I wish I were there in person to talk about other things.
Yeah, we'll get you here as soon as they let you come.
Soon. Okay, thanks a lot. Right. Thanks for inviting me. It's an honor.
Everyone, we'll see you at the next Committee for Sydney Live. Thanks for tuning in.